Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free. What do the following states have in common? California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Maryland. How many of you know what those following states have in common? I'll tell you.
All have ships.
They were the name of the 9 battle wagons that were anchored at Pearl Harbor that were destroyed, sunk, and totally dismembered by the Japanese Navy December the 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. I remember that very well because I was on the USS Curtis. We were anchored right opposite the Arizona, and right off of Fort Island. We just got back from Wake Island the night before. We delivered a lot of Marines, high-test aviation gasoline, and fighter planes to Wake Island on Thanksgiving Day. We pulled into Pearl Harbor Friday night, December the 3rd or 4th, tied up at the Naval Air Station at Fort Island, and half the crew went ashore on Liberty. The other half stayed aboard to take care of supplies and everything. And then at midnight they made us leave the anchorage there at Fort Island and go into the channel right opposite Fort Island, between Fort Island and Pearl City, because the USS Enterprise, the Big E, was due in with her task force, and she was normally tied up at Fort Island, so we had to make way for her. But the good Lord must have been watching, because she didn't get in there for 2 days later because of storms. If she'd have been there, she'd have been destroyed by the Japanese. And the Big E was principal ship there in the Battle of Midway. She destroyed 2 of the Japanese battle wagons and 4 of their carriers, and without the Big E we could have very easily lost the Battle of Midway, and of course they could have gone into Pearl Harbor. Well, that morning I was up bright and early, went to the fantail of the ship, and it was a beautiful Sunday morning, and I could hear the bands playing on the battleships across the harbor, and the boys playing their trumpets as they raised the flag. And then all of a sudden, right opposite us on Fort Island, a terrific explosion had happened. And the hangars and the airplanes were lined up. All of them went up in flames. And then all of a sudden I looked up and planes were diving on the hangars, and I thought they were dropping water bombs, but they were, about that time, the Japanese Zero flew over the fantail of the ship, spraying machine gun fire, and over the announcer, and the ship said, "All hands, general quarters, this is no drill. We are being attacked by the Japanese Air Force." And I ran away with machine gun pellets at me as this jet dive bomber sprayed machine gun fire at me, and I went down to the sick bay and got my first aid kit. And there's the old first aid kit that I had there at Pearl Harbor. That's a relic. I carried that all during the war. In fact, it got wet at the Battle of Okinawa when I was aboard an LCI that happened to get a kamikaze and threw me into the water. And in fact, there's even some blood on the bottom of from one of the guys that was on the ship that I was heading for the sick bay, and he came walking down the gangway, and blood was spurting out of his leg, and he had his ankle blown off. And I threw him down on the deck and grabbed my first aid kit and put a tourniquet on it and stopped the bleeding, and threw him over my shoulder and took him down to the sick bay and left him there. But poor guy died. He died about 2 days later. We couldn't save him. But About that time, I remember came over the loudspeaker, we need a pharmacist mate at the gangway. Our Liberty boat is just coming back from the fleet landing, and it's full of dead sailors and wounded sailors, and we need a pharmacist mate and 2 or 3 stretcher bearers and anybody that can report the after gangway. So I ran up there and looked over the side, and here was a Liberty boat that had maybe 40 or 50 men in it. Half of them were dead and half of them were wounded, and we helped carry them up and laid them out on the deck, and I administered first aid to them as best I could, and the ones with a lot of pain, we gave them a shot of morphine and took some mercurochrome and marked an M on their forehead that we'd give them the morphine. And anyway, I headed back to the sick bay to get my first aid kit refilled, and I no sooner got it filled than another announcement came over: stand by to abandon ship, stand by to abandon ship. And I got up the gangway out of the sick bay, and about that time another announcement came over the public address system: we need a pharmacist mate at the boat deck. We need a pharmacist mate at the boat deck. An enemy plane has crashed up there. So I ran up and took my 2 stretcher bearers with me, and the kamikaze, the first kamikaze of the war, drove into the old Curtis. There's a picture of the Curtis way back over there, right behind you, Ken Kaufman, and on the boat deck where the kamikaze hit and set the ship afire, and we lost half the crew, either killed or wounded. And however, we got even with them, you might say. We got a presidential unit citation for shooting down 2 of their planes and sinking one of the midget submarines. Should they give me a glass of water? Anyhow, that was a mess, and I remember taking a lot of the dead bodies over to the Naval Hospital the next day and try to identify them, but they had no dog tags on. The explosions had blown off the dog tags, and I remember going by the USS Oklahoma. One of the battleships was hit, and the Oklahoma had capsized, and when we went by it in the motor whaleboats, you could hear a tapping on the side of the boat. There were men inside that were tapping on the hull of the ship to let the men outside, the divers who were trying to get them out, and let them know that they were still alive. And anyhow, I went over to the Naval Hospital every day for 2 or 3 days in a row to identify the guys. Our guys were laid up in low life they were sort of stacked up like cords of wood on top of each other, and they had no dog tags, and I had a bunch of dental records there and tried to identify them with the dental records. But Friday at the end of the week went by the Oklahoma, and there was no tapping. The guys had all suffocated, and we lost of course the harbor was just full of oil and burning, and the guys trying to cut a hole in the side of the Oklahoma. Of course, the battle wagons had a 12-inch band of armor around them, and cutting through that 12-inch band of armor with acetylene torches and the oil on the water set the oil afire, and of course we had to go around it to get away from the circle to get back to the Curtis. But anyhow, that's probably my experience there at Pearl Harbor. After that, they sent us out to the South Pacific for 3 years, and we stopped by and picked up survivors of the Battle of Midway, and the old Lexington was in the Battle of Coral Sea, And the Coral Sea is a sea between Suva, Fiji, and New Caledonia, and we picked up a lot of survivors off the Lexington and Suva and took them over to New Caledonia. They had a cub unit. The Army had a cub unit for a naval hospital, but we had to turn our mess hall into a sick bay, you might say. They lowered down all the mess tables and picked up a lot of the guys were still wounded, but we were able to take them over to New Caledonia. And of course we stayed there for probably 3 or 4 months, and finally went up to Espiritu Santo in the Hebrides Island and set up with advanced base because the Marines were getting ready to land on Guadalcanal on August the 1st, and we had the PBY squadron aboard the Curtis, and we had the Admiral, Commander Aircraft South Pacific, and they scouted the Japanese fleet and the submarines and everything. They were trying to reinforce them on Guadalcanal, and I remember they gave me temporary duty from the Curtis, and I landed on Henderson Field in a PB-2Y. A PB-2Y had not only pontoons, but it had wheels that could land on the landing field there at Henderson Field, and we helped carry the wounded officers, mostly officers. We flew them back to the Curtis, and the USS Solace, the relief hospital ship, was anchored alongside the Curtis then, and I made 3 or 4 trips from Guadalcanal back to Espiritu Santo, and we stayed there for up until August of '43, and we had the Admiral aboard, and Chester Nimitz came aboard, and one time Eleanor Roosevelt came aboard. She came she landed on one of the Pan American clippers, and she landed there in Espiritu Santo, and she had come right from Pearl Harbor, and of course we hadn't had any mail for several weeks, and she had a meeting with Admiral Nimitz and C. Aubrey Fitz, the commander, up in the Admiral's cabin, and the guys on the ship found out that she came right from Pearl Harbor without any of our mail in that big old fancy PBN or Martin Pan American clipper, without even bringing any mail. And when she was leaving the ship, our crew stood along and booed the President's wife of the United States. Oh my God. And of course the old Admiral up there, he heard about that, and that night 1:30 in the morning, he called us out of our sacks, and we had to stand at attention on the quarterdeck for 3 hours in penalty for booing the President's wife. Oh Lord, yeah. Then I had a lot of experiences after that. Sort of hard to remember. Played AC-Deuce in cribbage, and I ran a poker game down in the dental office because we had lights down there at night, and I ran a poker game down there, and I did pretty good playing poker. And finally, in August of '43, we got orders to come back to the States, and went underneath the Golden Gate, and that was about it. Looking back, I remember becoming a shellback. I don't know, Ken, were you a shellback? When you cross the equator, instead of being a pollywog, anybody that's a pollywog becomes a shellback after he crosses the equator. And on our way to Noumea, I became a shellback and got a big old certificate up there signed by King Neptune. I remember they had a canvas bag about maybe 20 feet long, and it was full of oil, and first thing they did was shine a big bee on our head and made us crawl through this bag full of oil to meet King Neptune, and he hit us on the head with his scepter and it made us all shellbacked. And then, what else you want to know about me?
Sounds pretty good.
I came back station, got a leave, and 30 days leave, and they put me at the made me an officer, a warrant officer, stationed at the with the Marines, the 5th Marine Division at Camp Elliott, and they were getting ready to ship out for Iwo Jima, I think, one of those islands out there, and I didn't want any part of that, being I was a pharmacist mate, and I went down to the 12th Naval District and told them I was a survivor of Pearl Harbor, and they all shook my hand and said, well, we won't send you out there with the Marines, we'll send you on a fighting ship, we'll send you on the USS New Orleans. And I said, boy, that sounds good to me. I was a chief pharmacist mate at that time. And so I got my orders and started up to Mare Island to go aboard the USS New Orleans, and they stopped me part way up there in Los Angeles and said that the New Orleans was in dry dock, and they wanted me to give me temporary duty to be in charge of the first stage station in the Union Terminal in downtown Los Angeles. I was a chief pharmacist mate, and I had 2 or 3 third-class pharmacist mates working for me, and one of them that was with me, I had quite an experience with that guy. His name was Crawford, Carl Crawford. He was a third-class pharmacist mate, and he married Senator Nolan's daughter, the senator in Washington, D.C., in charge of the Finance Committee, and his daughter married Carl Crawford, and Carl Crawford owned a telephone exchange on Sunset Boulevard in downtown over in Hollywood. And the telephone exchange he had 50 girls working for him, and they kept in track. On the Screen Actors Guild, most of the movie stars that worked for the Screen Actors Guild, and including President Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild. Anyhow, they were all clients of Carl Crawford, and whenever they went on vacation or when somebody, they called the telephone girls and right down there, and then they'd get a hold of the studio and let these movie stars know where they were at. Anyhow, old Carl Crawford, a third-class pharmacist mate, he wanted to work during the daytime and take care of his Carl Crawford's Call Club there on Sunset Boulevard. So he wanted me to go at the racetrack and go at the studios and come up to his house, and I did put him off, and finally one afternoon it was raining like the dickens, and he says, let's go out to Santa Anita racetrack. And I said, okay, Carl. I said, I don't have anything else to do. Picked me up. I was living with my wife's in-laws, which reminds me, when the ship docked at Oakland, California in 1943 on a Saturday morning, I got a letter from my wife to meet her at her home in Glendale, California, and we were getting married the next day at Forest Lawn Cemetery there in the Wee Kirk of the Heather. And she had already called up the chaplain on my ship, and he came on down the ship to Forest Lawn Cemetery and married us. Anyhow, this one day I said, okay, we'll go out to the racetrack, Carl. And we get out there, and he picked me up in a purple Rolls Royce of all things. Took me out to the racetrack, and I said, well, let me pay to get in. Oh, he said, I got a pass here, you know. And I said, well, let me get a reserved seat. And he said, oh, I got a pass here for that. We went up first row right in front of the ending of the end of the racetrack and sit down in old Carl Crawford's private box. And about the second race, who come by us alongside old Carl and shook his hands, but Harry James and his wife.
Betty Grable.
Betty Grable. They had the box right next to old Carl. Yeah, Lord, I had quite an experience with old Carl. And about a month later, though, I got a letter or a telegram over to my wife's house and to report to the naval station at Mare Island, California, to go aboard the USS New Orleans. New Orleans was a heavy cruiser, and that was a ship that old President, Charlie Sanford was on, I think, who said, "Praise the Lord and passed in ammunition." He was a sky pilot, a preacher, and the Japs at Pearl Harbor had hit their ship. They had no electricity, and he went down the hold and helped the gun crew hoist ammunition up top side. And he said, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition, and we'll all stay free." And of course the guys took that up as sort of a battle cry, like "Remember the Alamo," you know. And in fact, I guess the Andrews sisters made a song out of it. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. But anyhow, after getting this letter to go up to Mare Island Naval Air Station, old Carl says, "Well, you're going right to San Francisco?" I said, "Yeah, Mare Island's about 30 miles north of Frisco." He said, "Why don't you stop at the Mark Hopkins Hotel?" He says, "I got connections there, and maybe they'll give you a free meal or something." I said, "Well, okay, thanks." I says, "I'll do that." And I hitchhiked anyhow, got on Highway 1 and hitchhiked up to San Francisco, and I got up there about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and I remembered what old Carl said, so I walked over to the old Mark Hopkins Hotel and went in there, and the gal at the desk says, "We've been expecting you, Chief." And I said, "How come you've been expecting me?" And she said, "Well, we just figured you might stop by and see us, and we got a room for you." And they took me up to the top of the Mark Hopkins, run one floor below the big restaurant up there, into this room that had a wet bar and had flowers on the table, and oh, they really had me fixed up good. Next morning I went down I said, "I don't know where I'm going to have enough money to pay for this darn racket." The old gal at the desk says, "Chief," she says, "you're on the house." She says, "Carl Crawford's brother-in-law is the manager of the car." Anyhow, I left there and went up and got aboard the New Orleans, and we went out to see. We got in time to the Battle of Iwo Jima, and we bombarded that island for 2 or 3 weeks before the Marines landed on it. And then we went over to Saipan, and before Iwo Jima, we were at Tarawa. We bombarded that island too. Then went to Saipan, and I played a trumpet. We had a little sort of a dance band on the New Orleans, and I went down there and played my trumpet all the time. And one day, after bombarding Okinawa, we went over to this little island called Ioshima to load ammunition, and it was a Sunday morning, and all the longshoremen back in the States were on strike, and so they called us guys from the sick bay to go over and load ammunition from the USS Nitro, ammunition handling ship that was anchored there in Hiroshima. And while we were loading ammunition, somebody over on the beach at Hiroshima sent a blinker over there that says some high-priced war correspondent had been killed over there, and did we have a preacher and a bugler there that were going to give him a temporary grave, and I was glad to get away from that old ammunition handling bunch of guys. So the old preacher and I got in the longboat and we went over to this dock in Hiroshima, and we started back in the forest, and here comes the burial party out. It was raining like the dickens, and they said, we got tired of waiting for you guys. We just put this old guy in a temporary grave here on Hiroshima. And I said, what was his name? Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle. Of course, they dug him up from there later on, and he buried him at the same place a bunch of our guys are buried, in the National Cemetery right below Diamond Head there, and back in Hawaii. But anyhow, let's see, I forget. Oh yeah, then I got orders that I'd made warrant officer, warrant back to Pearl Harbor for reassignment. Okay, so they picked me up in an LCI. They were using it for a mail boat and a passenger boat between all the ships that were right outside Okinawa. And we went over to the USS New Mexico to pick up some passengers. Just left the New Mexico, and another kamikaze came down through the stacks of the New Mexico, missed the battle wagon, and hit the LCI that was on. I remember I just jumped into the LCI, and some guy had hurt his knees, I guess. He jumped in there, and being a pharmacist man, I still had my first aid kit, and I went up to the front, up to the forward hatch, and was putting a bandage on this guy's ankle when this kamikaze hit, and threw me off the ship into the water. But I had no first aid kit with me. And I remember the tugboat, the USS Navajo, yelled, "Is anybody alive over there?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm alive." I said, they pulled me out of the water, took me over to the USS Antares, which was a ship going back to Pearl Harbor. And we left the next day, and that was the last of July in 45. And I remember that 2 days off of, or about a day and a half, I guess, off of Saipan. They called us to general quarters at night. I was, of course, a passenger and sleeping in the officers' quarters. They said there was a Japanese submarine that fired a torpedo at us. But luckily it missed us. And later on at the court-martial of the USS Indianapolis, the skipper of the Japanese submarine that sunk the Indianapolis said that he had one torpedo left after he sunk the Indianapolis, and he was heading back to Truk, and he fired at this Navy ship but missed it on the way back. And I think that was the same old ship I was on. But anyhow, I got back to Pearl Harbor, and they made me over to Maui Naval Air Station as a personnel officer there for 6 months. I had 50 waves and 50 hospital corpsmen. I was responsible for their leave and liberty and all this and that. I had my own Jeep and access to my own airplane. And then, of course, the war was over with, and 6 months later I finally got discharged. Flew back home and got off at the Union Station here, and midnight, nobody in there. Walked up and got the streetcar out to my house and knocked at my door, and my mom answered the door and gave me a hug. I finally got out of the Navy after 8 years.
8 years.
8 years. Yeah. Yeah, I had a lot of experiences. I wouldn't change them for the world, but and I was lucky, just plain lucky there. Because like I say, we lost half the crew there, killed or wounded at Furrow. I had started one time going to the gangway. I started through the hangar deck, and another guy yelled for a doc pharmacist mate, and I stopped to see what his trouble was in the fight. I kept going through that hangar deck. That was where this one bomb exploded that killed 45 guys in the gun handling room. But when I was on the way back to get that Liberty boat, you know. That was another time I got awful lucky. And the guy that I patched up, I met him years later at a reunion. We had a ship's reunion at Norfolk Naval Air Station, and he came out there. I wanted to shake the hand of Rod Phelps. Is old Rod Phelps here, the guy that saved my life at Pearl Harbor? Harold Oliver, his name was. Yeah. Anyhow, there it is. There's the blood on it. The DNA could tell him the old guy that died.
Quite an experience.
Quite an experience. Yeah, it was quite an experience. I was lucky that I didn't get shipped out with them Marines, the 5th Marines, because they lost half their guys at Iwo Jima. My name is Dr. Rod Phelps. I'm a survivor of Pearl Harbor, 8 years in the United States Navy. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.